Greetings and welcome, creatives around the world, people of the internet. Welcome to Creative Briefing, an ad hoc show that looks at creativity in all the guises, all the shapes and forms it comes in, and where I encourage you to explore your creativity and find an outlet for that creative side of your brain. Each day I look at a different aspect of creativity. You know, I've covered animation, graphic design, sketching, music. So I try and mix it up. I try and cover a lot of the bases that I'm into and interested in, and a lot of the avenues I like to explore my creativity, and try and get you to find a different avenue of creativity to explore yourself too. Whether you are in a creative field, try something different, or whether you're someone who thinks they're not creative at all. That's not true. I highly encourage you to try and find a way to be creative. So today, every artist's favourite subject, colour theory. Anytime you add theory at the end of a phrase, you know, it sends shivers down an artist's spine. Theory means using your brain and having to think and conceptualise, or be less conceptual actually than maybe just painting, drawing. Music theory, obviously, that's every musician's favourite subject is music theory. Visual artists love colour theory. Actually, it's not that daunting. It's it follows rules like anything. And there are tricks to help put those rules into practice and to remember them, and it will help you become a better artist with a little understanding of the way things are and why they're like that. So with all that being said, let's dive in and take a look at what colour theory is. So obviously colour is it's the science behind colour, and I'm not going to get into the physics of like how light travels and bounces off of surfaces and absorb certain frequencies of light, absorb different colours. That's a whole other subject. The psychology of colour and how colours work together, which colours work together, how colours are blended, those sorts of theoretical ideas. So the components of colour. What is colour made up of? Well, when we talk about colour, we generally think of hue, which is its pigment. In times before digital, obviously, natural sources had to be found and mixed with, resins and oils to make, a colour. We didn't have photography to replicate in chemicals what those colours were. So we've evolved to the state now where digital is a massive part of what colour is. So when we're talking about colour in digital terms, in terms of art and design, we talk about hue, saturation and value. Those are the three components that make up colour. Now those still apply to colour theory in an analog world. The theory of colour, what its hue is, how saturated, how intense that colour is, that hue is, and its value, its brightness, how bright that colour is, how close to white or black it is. Or so when we're mixing paint, it's harder to put numbers digitally. When you're in a program like Photoshop, it's easy to add a number to build up, or add the numbers to build up a color. When you're mixing paint, obviously it's a little less precise than that, but understanding which direction the hue needs to be adjusted to achieve a certain color, how much pigment needs to be to make it saturated, or how much black or white needs to be added to change its value. Though those concepts obviously still apply. Now, so hue, saturation, and value, the three components of color. In the digital world, hue is from 0 to 359 degrees. Obviously 360, you're all the way back round to 0 again, and we're at the same point. 360 degrees, obviously that's talking about a circle. And when we're talking about circles, we are talking about the color wheel. So 0 typically is where red resides, that's 0, and then every degree we go around the circle, we then go through certain color values. 180 on the color wheel is blue, in the blues, and then we go all the way back round to 0 again, 359 to 0, and we're back at red again. So the hue is described by its position on the color wheel. If we go back to our chart, saturation is from 0 to 100%. Again, these are digital interpretations in programs like Photoshop or similar. It's either 0, not at all saturated, in which case it's grey, or it's 100% saturated. There's 100% of that pigment, of that hue in the color, to make that color really intense. And then there's value, which goes from 0, which is black, all the way to 100%, which is white. This is brightness. Now, Adobe uses the HSB model, hue, saturation, and brightness. Other programs may use HSV. I know several programs that use value instead of brightness, but just know that those terms are interchangeable. Value means brightness. I'm not sure where value came from. I'm not sure how it got given that term, but value is like, within the artistic community, people talk about painting in value a lot, or painting your values first and adding color. Controlling value is controlling the lighting a lot of the time. That's where your highlights and shadows are kept, in the value, in the darks and lights. The hue and the saturation, color is almost separate from that, and in some video systems as well, that the luminosity channel is separate from the color channels, just because a lot of the information that we see and we understand comes from the lightness and darkness, and which creates the shape and form of objects, than the color do. Color informs us less than light and shade does. So just be aware of that. HSB for hue, saturation, brightness, or HSV, hue, saturation, and value. Those are terms that are intermittently used. So if we look at our color wheel again, you can see that this is sort of segmented. Obviously the color wheel is more gradual, so one consistent gradient from each tone, each hue to the next. This is overly simplified, and as you can see in this wheel, we have the tints of each color going towards white. That is where its value is being reduced. Let's take a look at what that conceptually works out to be in practice. So make sure I'm on the right layer. Let me see, yes, you're seeing that. Okay, so you're seeing my color picker. So here we see, I'm in Photoshop, and you can see when I'm adjusting the hue, this is the color circle stretched out into a linear map. And you can see at 0, we're at red. We come round to around 180, we're at the cyan blue end of the scale. We come all the way around to 0 again, or this Okay, so we're at 0 down here, and we come up to 180, then we go all the way back up to 359, and then we're back to 0 again. So this counts from the bottom up. For some reason, I always assumed Photoshop counted from the bottom down. I'd never realized that before. Okay, so when we talk about hue, let's just get our pure color. Let's cancel that for a second, and let's make a just make red. I'm going to 0 on the, and with 100% saturation and 100% brightness, or value in this case, and we're going to fill that with that color. So that's just a, let's take a look at what the same hue, that same red, but we reduce the saturation. We're just reducing one, we reduce that to 50 thereabouts. So that is the same hue and the same brightness, but with less saturation, less intensity of the pigment. So now that enables the brightness to show through. Now there's less pigment, there's less of that hue showing through. The brightness kind of takes over. We're seeing more white because with the brightness is at 100%. So let's take a look. Let's bring the saturation back up to 100, but now let's reduce the value to around 50. So now we have more of the black coming through. It's still a fully intense red. It's still highly saturated, but with less value, it now becomes a darker saturated red. So one final look. Let's take a look at the saturation and the brightness at 50%. Now we have a very subdued color. It's not very vibrant because it's only got 50% of its saturation, and it only has 50% brightness, so it's a lot of gray in there. So the gray is taking over. It's more of a tint. The saturation, the low saturation, and the medium saturation and the medium value is creating more of a grey tint. So that is how color is constructed. So let's see. Let's touch on a gradient real quick, just quickly. Whoops. There we go. Let's see what gradient. Let's go from seeing that. Yes, you're seeing that. So we have our red. It's our same 100% red, 100% saturation, 100% brightness. Let's take a look at this color and see how the colors morph over time. Let's go to that same red again, but let's now reduce the brightness to 0. It goes to black. So the only thing that changes is it loses all of its value. The value goes from 0. Now I'm just going to do a gradient from top to bottom. Now we see the red stays its full intensity. You can see it's very intense red at the top. Now we go through that rich dark red all the way to black. The intensity of the red doesn't change, but its darkness does. So let's try another gradient. Let's see. This time, let's bring the brightness up and the saturation down. So this time it's going to white. because the brightness is all the way up, but there's no intensity of color. So without the absence of color, we just have pure white. So now we have a gradient that goes from red to white, but we can see how differently the red becomes less intense, because even though it's still up here, the value is still 100%. It's fully saturated. The intensity of the color is really, really intense. As we move through the gradient here, we are moving to just a less saturated, so the red fades out. There's just different ways that the colors will morph. Let me see if there's anything else I can explore with. Let's do that again. Let's have a look. So if we, okay, well, let's see if we change the brightness and the saturation changes, stays the same, but let's say we morph from a red to a yellow. So the brightness and the saturation will change. We're just gonna make a gradient along the color wheel. So we can see that the intensity, fully intense all the way through. The colors are fully saturated. The brightness doesn't change. We're just moving through the color wheel. So that's how the three components of color are built, and how they can morph and change between each other, and how you might mix, how you might blend a red to a black. Let's take a look at families. So color theory and color families, we talk about how certain colors work well with each other. So complementary colors sit opposite each other on the color wheel, and if we look at the color wheel real quick, we can take a quick look at complementary colors. So we have reds, and completely opposite, if we do a line 180, we have the blues or the cyans. If we look at orange, then we go across, we've got like a more royal blue. Yellows, its complementary color would be like a purple or a violet. So complementary colors perfectly balance each other. They complement, obviously the complementary colors, they complement each other really well due to the frequency of the light, or just the psychology of the human brain. For whatever reason, those colors have been deemed to work really well together, and they really do. So when you're building a color palette, when you're building or designing or looking at an art project, complementary colors, they add energy and vitality. They're opposites, but they, opposites attract. They sort of support each other, even though there's a lot of contrast between them. But it's not a harsh or abrupt contrast. It's a harmonious contrast. So then there's like triadic colors, and these are just a selection. That's three of many different color families. And if whatever software you might be using, you may have the ability to pull in libraries or color groups or themes in into a color palette, into your swatches or whatever. I mean, if you look on on the web, you will find groups of colors that work well together, that have been amassed by the users or by experts or by recognized families, whether they're complementary, triadic, or whatever. Or whether they support like a natural earth tones, gray tones. You can find a gazillion color themes, color palettes on the internet, and they're all conceptually grouped so that they help tell a particular story. Like I said, whether it's a natural feeling or an ocean vibe or a earth tones, or whether it's something along those lines. So Triadic Colors, as the name suggests, use 3 colors, and they are 120 degrees apart on the wheel. So you get like this triangle if you put each dot, you know, at 120 degrees apart. And this creates a bit more visual harmony and maybe a bit less, not conflict, but energy than the complementary colors. There's a bit more balance there with the Triadic Colors. And if we look at the color wheel, we can see that, say, if we're choosing a pink, you know, 120 degrees from that would be, you know, a green, and then we'll get 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We'll get like a violet blue type of color. So we're looking from here to here to here. So those 3 colors work well together. If we're looking at let's say an orange, so we've got an orange, we'll go to a purpley color, and then like a seafoam green color. Those three hues, and of course you can use different tints of those hues. You can have like a really saturated orange working just as well with a more subdued mauve and a subdued seafoam. In fact, maybe you want one punchy accent color and the other's a bit more pastel-y, or vice versa, depending on what your needs are. You could have one pastel-y main color and then a couple of punchy accent colors. But using Triadic Colors, or a Triadic family, a Triadic set, can create, you know, a visual harmony. Analogous colors, they sit adjacent to each other on the color wheel, and that is a bit more harmonious and unified. So if we were to choose, if our main color was, say, a cyan blue, we could, you know, enter into the blue green and also into the more true blue colors, and we could use colors from this range here, and they will be analogous, and it will be a bit more unified. So that there's less variation, and maybe you could add one punchy color into your accent color, but use a lot of similar tones to create a balance and an overall subtle variation. Subtlety is the name of the game with analogous colors. So those are really 3 of just many ways, and probably 3 most sort of common ways to assemble families or groups of colors. So we looked at themes. So practical, let's look at how that, let's say, for example, let's take a nice rich orange, and actually I'm on the right layer. Make the brush a bit bigger. So nice orange color. Now if we use complementary color, opposite an orange would be like a royal blue. Let's make that a little less intense. So I can mess with the intensity and the saturation and the value, but the hue is still the same. So a lot of this would still, you know, it would still work. So let's find something in here, maybe, yeah. So these two colors work really well together. Let's look at, say, Triadic. So if we're here, we're on 224, so let's do 100. So and then, so that was 220, so whoops, 220 plus 120, 340. So these colors, these tones, the hue on the color wheel are harmonious. They work well with each other as a color palette, and variations. You could use, like, you know, tints of each. So let's do one more. Let's do a nice rich purple, because I like that color. Okay, purple. And it's complementary. Oops. Would be a yellow, like a pure yellow. And let's bring, just for variation, let's bring the saturation down a little bit, and we can get, that's a nice pair, that goes really well together. And obviously these are just pure tones. Using tints of these, as I said, and using the, you know, one punchy accent might be more applicable for home decor or painting furniture, or doing you know, a logo or something. Now when we come to painting artwork or fantasy or comic book or even portraits, color theory obviously still applies. How we mix and use color, the color tells a lot of story. Like in the old days of the great masters, certain colors would, you know, obviously purple represents regal royalty. While the person may be, you know, their flesh tone, you don't have a lot of variation to work with. The flesh tone, the room may be what the room is. They may be wearing a purple dress, or they may have a purple brooch, or there may be a purple background. Certain colors we use psychologically to represent, you know, certain ideologies for whatever. So talking about painting, let's do something very simple demonstration real quick. Let's just paint a circle. Let's just paint a sphere. We make some sci-fi orb of magical origins. I'm not sure. Let's just make something up. Let's see. We'll make it like a bluey purple maybe. Let's see. Okay, so make sure I'm on the right layer, of course. There we go. Let's just fill that. So obviously that's great for old-fashioned comic books, but it doesn't have a lot of let's see. So what I like to do when I'm painting something like this, I'll create like a color palette. It might be on a different layer or on something to the side of the layer I'm painting on, but I will I won't use the swatches, I'll just use the colors. And so I'm going to pick a few, say, analogous colors. And I might do this with a paint palette. I might have all my, obviously you have your paints on a physical palette, and you would dip the brush and you would mix in a separate part, and it's very similar to that technique here with digital paint. So I might go maybe whoops, there we go, I'll go 2 clicks in that direction, and then if I sample that color again, bring up my color picker, and I might go a couple of clicks in this direction. So I've got like an analogous bracketing of and then what I might do then, let's pick an opposite. So let's go down to yeah, something like that, and I might put that down here. So now I've got these colors, I can, while this is my, and if you don't see what I'm doing, I'm holding down Option on the keyboard, and that turns the brush cursor into the color picker, and I think that's true of many digital paint programs. And if you sort of look down here, you will see the foreground paint well will change to indicate which color I've sampled. So I can quickly, paint in just by, oops, let's turn on, if I hit the slash key, that will turn on, it'll spare the transparency for that layer. So I've got the opacity, let me try that, turn that down a little bit so I can build it up. The opacity is at 50, or the flow is at 50%. Let me turn the opacity by holding Shift and hitting 5, and then turn the flow back up to 100. That way I can blend just by very lightly. I'm using the stylus, so I can, just paint a little. I'm just very, very crudely and very roughly just fudging in some colors here. So what I might do actually is set this to multiply, and then get my darker tone right there. Then I will sample that, and then I'll use this let's set that back to normal. So that I've got 2 darker tones there, so I can, let's go back and paint that the correct color. And now I can sample my darker tone and then just paint in some, I can make my brush a little bigger. Oops, forgot to turn the transparency back on, pardon me, there we go. Now my transparency is locked, I don't have to worry about painting over the edges. So I'm just crudely again painting over the blue, just to try and give it a little shape, taking that base blue layer that we created at the beginning, and I can always go back and just add in a bit more of these mid-tones, just creating texture. And what we're trying to do is obviously, give it some interest, make it look a bit more believable. We can also add a little bit of purple tones in here too, and again, because I'm using let's try turn the opacity down a little bit, to like 20, I can just very subtly add some subtle color tones. Now, one thing, if I turn transparency lock back off, if I select this, my ad hoc color palette, what I can do, what I like to do sometimes, is add a Gaussian blur to that. And what that does is it softens the edges between. So let me demonstrate real quick. If I bring up the color palette, I can also sample the colors here. So you can see if I move the cursor outside of this color picker window, I can now, and I'm just clicking and dragging. And what you can see, if I click in the middle here, I'm sampling my original blue. And I can click here and sample, you know, 1 click to the pinks, 2 clicks to the pinks, my original blue, 1 click to the blue, 2 click to the blue. So what I can do now is, by clicking in the middle where we've blurred that, by looking at the color picker, I now have these in-between tones that I can now use infinitely. And this is really extending the analogous color palette. So I can make blends by hold down Option and click somewhere in the middle. I can now have this half, you know, blue 1 and half blue 2, and then I can click in between these and get, so I'm really able to blend with a lot more precision. So anyway, I'm just building up some texture just by using this small sort of palette of colors. And we've got like a textury, I'll bring the brush down a little bit where I've got some purple. I can introduce some blues back into that purple. Now I'm just bringing some blue, some pink texture down into the blue at the bottom here. Just very light touches just to blend it in and add some subtle tonal. So very crudely and very roughly, I've created something that's more like a sphere rather than just a flat blue. So what we are doing is lighting, essentially. Like I said earlier, I mean, the color values, the color information is sort of secondary to the, you know, the light and dark. That's what really helps describe an object. The color is almost secondary. So what we're doing is we are creating lighting. We're lighting an object that is just flat or just pixels, and we are adding light information to it. So it helps to, you know, have a little flashlight and then look at an object and see how the light falls upon it, and we can, you know, helps us understand observing sunlight, how it creates shadows at different times of the day. It really helps us understand how shadows fall, how highlights hit an object, different surfaces and whatnot. Excuse me. Thirsty business. So one technique you see a lot with lighting in cinematography, as well as in like fantasy or sci-fi art, comic art, you will see what is known as a kicker. And I always like to light in videography or cinematography with a kicker. It helps separate the object from the background. It helps create it really extends the form, what we're trying to describe, the form with light and shadow, which is what we're doing. But the kicker adds some drama. It really helps, extend that form lighting. So if we look at an example real quick, we have some reference. And I obviously, like I said, picking up a flashlight and lighting an object, the internet, of course, is the most valuable resource for reference material. I just found this. I was doing helping a student with a dragon painting, and thought that finding dinosaur reference would be a good reference for looking at how light falls on the skin. Obviously, we don't have any photographic reference of dinosaurs, but there are thousands of illustrations and paintings, and in this case, this was like a model or a figurine, and it's been lit very cinematically, and we can take a look at this and see how the lighting helps describe the object and also add some drama. So we see this area here. This is what I call the kicker, and you can see it on up here and on the horns. Maybe if I zoom in real quick, you can see it on the horns here. We can see it on where it hits the flesh as a kicker there. Down here, even on the terrain. So the kicker is like a bright light, typically with color, that adds a nice sharp edge, usually on the dark edge. Maybe the key light is here and you have a kicker on the opposite of the key light. That's typically how a kicker works. You have the key light with a main, and you can see in this illustration, here's the specular highlight. This is where the main light is falling. The light source is up here and it's hitting this way, and the shadow is under here, but we have this kicker on the opposite side of the specular that is help rounding out that that object to give it form. So that's what I like to use as a kicker. Now if we look at the kicker, we try and analyze its color makeup. The kicker has high saturation and high value. So high saturation means it's a really rich color, whatever tone it might be, and you'll see, blues, greens, reds, whatever. Usually a kicker is a nice vibrant color to create that drama. Sometimes it might just be white, depending on the motivation. Sometimes there's motivation, sometimes it's just for drama and for effect. So the specular, if we look at the specular highlight, the specular here really has high value but low saturation. It's almost like a pure white or a very pale tint of the base color. So not much saturation from the light or from the base color of the object, but there's lots of white in the specular, and the shadow has high saturation but low value. Let's take a look at the shadow areas down here. You can see it's a very dense, rich color, but it's low value. It's just dark, and sometimes it's close to pure black. So those are some general rules of thumb. That isn't obviously, sometimes the specular can have more saturation. Sometimes there isn't going to be a kicker at all. Sometimes the saturation could be maybe less saturated. It depends on the circumstance, but those are the general rules of thumb that I like to stick by when I'm painting, because they don't often lead you astray. You can often veer slightly one way or another from them, based on the on a case by case, object by object basis, whether it's glossy or matte, large or small, textured or smooth. That's a whole other subject I won't get into, but general rule of thumb, you can follow those guidelines. So if we're looking at say painting with a kicker, so let's create another palette, and I'm going to add like a nice, let's say this, I'm doing this whole sci-fi thing. Maybe this is some kind of alien egg. I don't know. Maybe it's an orb, like in, I don't know, some kind of an orb of Sauron. And am I on the right layer still? Yes. So let's create another little color palette. Maybe it's hovering over some kind of volcano or something. So the motivation would be like fiery colors. Let's get a little bit more red in there, or richer orange at least. Okay, so here's my kicker color palette. I'm going to blur these again, just so I can get some in-between tones. And let me turn on my transparency lock, and let's start adding some make my a little bit bigger. Actually, in fact, it looks like this key light is on the wrong side here, but I'll continue with this for right now. Let's turn my opacity down. We can add maybe a yellow kicker up at the top here where it really should be. Yeah, like I said, the yellow the kicker really should be on the dark side of the object, and let the key light is where the specular would be. So I've kind of got it a little back to front on this one. Wasn't really thinking, but yeah, I'm just doing this very quickly and very crudely. You'll have to, oops, a little bit. Let's bring the opacity down so I can paint a bit of a broader stroke, and then just build up. And I'm just doing light strokes over the let's add some oranges into here. So let's get a little bit of a big brush and try and blend this. Whoops. And the trick is to sort of feather it so it looks somewhat natural and it's blended. Of course, I can go back to my, to my blues and my shadow blues and just try and blend that in a bit more if it's got a little bit over zealous. Can also add some, let's add some purples in here just to add some variation. So now our ball has some variation. We can add a little bit of some small highlights elsewhere in there. If it was textured, you do a more precise job than I'm doing right now, but I'm just adding some of the kicker colors into the overall. You could do that if you wanted to. Add little bits of color. You could add some, maybe, say, some veining. And by using let me see, my opacity is at 20. Let's make my opacity down to 10. You can add some really, really faint veining, like it is one of those alien eggs. Yeah, I'm just doing this very crudely. I'm not really thinking too much about what I'm doing and just ad-libbing here. But again, we're just trying to add some texture to make something to look a little less. And you could work on that and build it up and maybe even go back in with a darker color and add some shadowing to the veining. Anyway, and of course you can always go get the base color, get a nice big fat brush, and then maybe just knock it back anywhere that you feel like you might have to. So we've created something that's a bit more fantastical. It's a bit richer and a bit more texture, just by creating our palette, creating a palette for our kicker, using some in-between tones by blurring it, and then just building up with brush strokes. One more thing. So, okay, depth. Let's talk about depth for a second here. Color theory when it comes to depth. We haven't really talked about cool and warm, so let's talk about that real quick. Cool colors add distance. They make objects look further away. Warm colors, they reduce the distance. They make objects appear closer. So when you're painting and you've just got this flat painting and it may be looking a little flat, doesn't have a lot of dynamics. Maybe, a trick to try is by adding cool colors to push the distance, the background further away, and then adding some warm tones to bring the foreground objects closer. So let's explore what we mean by cool and warm. Make sure I'm on the right layer here. So let's bring up the color palette real quick. And smaller brush, hardness. Okay. So cool colors. Oops. Try that again. What on earth is going on here? There we go. Cool colors. Those are your blues. Some greens, like bluer greens. Let's take a look at the color wheel. So that, for example, that's a bluey green. These are cool colors, blues and greens, and then warm colors obviously are your reds and yellows and oranges, pinks. And then of course with the greens we have like on the yellow side of green, like a grass green. An olive green is more blue, and a teal is more blue, but a grass green or forest green is probably fairly neutral. So things like blue, colors like greens, and then also if we look at purples, purples can be closer to red, like a fuchsia, in which case it's warm, or a purple can be closer to like a violet, closer to blue, in which case it's cool. So there are some colors that sort of dance on the edge. Of course, there are also grays, which are, they don't have any heat. However, you may have been familiar, if you've ever used markers, you may be familiar with cool grays or warm grays. Grays, unless they're artificial, like you get grays in the paint store, even when you go to the paint store, the grays these days have tints in them. But most grays are they're very rarely completely neutral. They're usually, one way or another. So if we take a look at greys and then we add some saturation to it, but let's say on the side of, you know, usually yellows and oranges, and we add a little bit of saturation to that, now we have a warm grey. Let's do that with this one as well. Our hue is down here in the oranges. We'll add a little bit of saturation. Let's do the same with this one. We'll move it up to the oranges, add about 20 of saturation. And then finally with the dark grey, so now we have these warm greys, and you know, usually in marker sets or Pantone colors or whatever, they'll usually have, you know, this will be like a warm 3, 5, 7, 9, a warm 5, warm 9. These are just completely grey. In some circles, these might be considered cool, but they are very neutral, and these would be considered warm greys. I think personally, I would describe a cool grey to be further on the side of blue. So I'm going to add, like, you know, let's say 10 degrees of value-wise, they're the same sort of tone, but they have a tint to them. So if I do the same thing with this, go up to the blues, make that about, and the last two, let's go up to the blues. One last time, add some saturation. You can see these are definitely on the cool side of grey, and these are on the warm side of grey, and while these are completely neutral. So that is what we talk about when we talk about cool and warm. So let's get rid of all that and let's put that into practice real quick. Let's pick a, let's see, let's do a green. Let's paint some mountains. Let's see. Brushes, try this brush. Will this work? No, I do not like the smoothing. Does that have smoothing on? No. Let me go back to that other brush. Turn the hardness up a little. Oops. So I have some mountains, and again I'm just fudging this in real quickly as a demonstration for the theory of the colour. There's some mountains in the distance. Let's add some darker greens to that. Whoops. I'm going to turn, yeah, let's turn on that for a second. So just fudging in some, oops, fudging in some basic texture for some mountains. Nothing too grandiose there. Let's get that a little bigger on the screen. And let's say, okay, so in the middle ground there might be, oh, maybe there's a, it could be a dirt field or something. Let's just pick a brown and do a, I'm not overly thinking this, I'm just scrubbing in some color just to demonstrate an idea. Maybe there's like some fields. Let's add some basic modeling to that, and then in the foreground, let's say we've got some trees. Just gonna fudge in some trees. And then got some grassland. Let's just make this a bit of a grassy colour. A little bit of a landscape, and so maybe our foreground object, let's just see, it could be, let's just say it's a rock of some kind of sacrificial rock that in this fantasy painting we've got some kind of let's add some shape and form to that. Okay, just a basic lump of rock. It's a little flat, and again, this isn't a masterpiece. It's just a scribble. But to create some separation between the foreground already stands out because the background is darker in value. It's darker tones, but the foreground has some contrast that way. But let's take a blue. And with a nice big soft brush, I'm just going to lock transparency, and let's make the opacity of the brush like 10%. And I'm just painting a very light coat of blue over that distant and middle ground. And it's just got a slight blue haze to it that, even if I say the haze helps, when you look at the distance, you see there's a lot of particulate matter in the air. So when things in the distance, they tend to get more hazy. If you ever see those, iconic mountain scenes where the mountains get more and more sort of diffuse in the distance, that's because of the particulate matter in the air. The reflected light can't, bounce cleanly back through objects nearer to us. Obviously, they're bouncing through, the light bouncing off of them is bouncing through less matter in the air. So, making something hazy in the distance isn't a bad thing. But say we didn't want to do that, we were not looking for that sort of effect for our painting, we could always use multiply and make it, darker, or at least keep the same tone by managing the strokes. We're not making it lighter with that hazy blue, but we are making it bluer. So, and then let's add some orange to this rock. And I'm just going to use normal for now, but maybe a little yellow on one side. Maybe it's like reflecting sunlight or something. You can have some kind of motivation. But what we've done, we've made the foreground object warmer and the background objects cooler, and that's created separation. It's created distance between them, and we can use that, you know, with varying effect. You can use stronger, make something in the distance very blue and something in the foreground very warm, or it can be a very sort of subtle effect. But psychologically, that's how we can artificially create distance on just a 2D plane. It's just a painting. It's just a screen of pixels. But that is how we can create distance using color temperature, warm or cold. So that is today's topic. We have been going over an hour, so that was a bit of a lengthy one. I thought I was only scratching the surface of color theory, but obviously it's a big subject, and even scratching the surface I went over an hour. That's far longer than I usually like to go. If you've stuck with me this long, thank you. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you had fun. Any questions or corrections? Maybe you've got a different way or a different understanding or a different theory that you would like to use with color. By all means, post in the thread to the video or any of these places here. You know, get in touch. I'm always up for discussion and debate. So if you have any questions, comments, you know where to find me. Please do your social due diligence, like, subscribe, share, comment, all that good stuff. And until next time, go be creative. Thanks for watching.